Hey y'all, welcome to the Team LocoFit Roundtable, hosted by me, Laurin Conlon, owner of Team LocoFit. Each week, I am joined by one of our coaches to dive headfirst into the nutrition, training, mindset, and coaching strategies we use with our clients. If you loved the show, please subscribe, leave us a review, tell a friend, you know the drill. And for more information about coaching, the programs we offer, and additional content, visit teamlocofit.com. All right, and we are back, and this week I'm joined by Rick, our mental health consultant.
Hello.
And today's podcast, well, I guess our series is going to be on parenting.
Yes.
And there's so many different ways to parent, but we wanted to put something together because there's a lot of people who are either already parents who listen to this show, or our clients, or people who are soon to be parents. So we just thought it would be really relevant to do a two-part series on this. Mm-hmm. And the first one's going to be more from the parenting side of it, like how to raising kids. Mm-hmm. I'm what is the word I'm looking for?
That's fine.
Okay, there we go.
Child rearing,
yeah. That was not the word I was going to say, but child rearing, that's what the podcast is going to be about.
Yeah. So basically, I want to get into some of the basics, more parenting overall and less specifics, because every parent develops their own style. Everybody has their own kind of set of beliefs about what parenting should be. So this isn't going to be this is the proper way to do this, because then it really just passes judgment. And there's more than one way to skin a cat when it comes to parenting. So whatever produces the results that you're looking for, by all means. So some basics, and I think this is really important because, especially in today's society, boys and girls, when we're raising kids, I think the first thing to understand is that as children, they are more similar than they are different. Sex generally refers to a biological term, which explains, which is used to determine your chromosomal impact, like you're either a boy or you're a girl. That's basically when we refer to the term sex, it's a biological trait. When we talk about gender, right, now we're talking about more of a social construct, in which we're talking more about masculinity and femininity, and there's a spectrum that those things will fall on. And so I think it's important to make those distinctions. And because both boys and girls are children, they're human beings, this makes them much more similar than they are different. And I think sometimes we get into a space of, am I going to have a boy or a girl, and that's going to change the way I raise my kid. And I think sometimes we get so wrapped up into that we forget that they're really pretty similar, and it doesn't really matter what gender they are. What really matters is how you are parenting. Does that make sense?
No, that makes perfect sense. And I think that it's a really normal, I don't have kids, but I would think that's a normal thing, I feel like I'd be a better boy mom, better girl mom, or better this, or I'm so nervous about whatever. And then trying to worry about all those things, but they really are. And obviously there are going to be differences, right? That's
sure,
obvious,
there are,
especially as they get older, but
for
foundational
example,
things.
Yes, they've done studies where they took 50,000 kids and they administered a number of psychological assessments, right, to just boys. And what you get is a bell-shaped curve where the boys sit. They take another 50,000 girls and they administer the same test. So what do they get? They get this bell-shaped curve. And what they found is that when you superimpose those bell-shaped curves, 90% of the masses were similar, leaving only 10%, which was kind of the shoulders or the outliers, which is really masculine or really feminine. But 90% of what they were looking at is exactly the same, or has overlap. And so the idea of it becomes, it's less about the gender to me and more about how you're raising the kid. So parenting should be more about, or what we want it to be about, is about values, about character, about developing skills like reading, writing, teaching them morals, understanding, compassion. Worry less about boy-girl gender roles and more about the lessons in life you're developing and how your child is developing, rather than he's a boy, so I've got to give him cars and guns and whatever, or she's a girl, so I've got to give her dolls and pretty dresses. They'll pick those things up along the way, especially once they start to get into their peer groups.
I always hated dolls.
Surprise!
Which is probably not surprising. I know you're really shocked right now, but I just wanted to let you know.
Yeah.
I always people, other girls my age would have the baby dolls take care of, and I was why do I want to take care of the kid? Why do I want to take care of this doll? I would just push it aside. And
So what did you play with as a kid?
Horses.
Oh, that's right.
Plastic horses. Mm-hmm. Not obviously real horses too, but they used to have this toy companies. Any horse girls listening, it was like Breyer. So it was like plastic horses. So it was kind of like Barbie, but for horses. Mm-hmm. And then I would have like stable and like, or I was obsessed with Beanie Babies. I like love stuffed animals.
Okay.
So, but anything I had to like take care of, I was like, no, let it go over there.
But you played with your Beanie Babies in the same capacity, and your horses in the same capacity that anybody else plays with dolls or GI Joes.
Yeah, I wasn't like a sociopath. But like,
you were burning them with a magnifying glass out in the backyard.
No, that was later in life. Just kidding. I wasn't doing
that. All right. But even before children are born, parents often start to think about their child differently, right? We start to look at different colors for boys and girls. We look at different clothes. We look at different toys. So the idea of gender neutral rearing is like basically a psychological impossibility. Like in order for us to get rid of those things, it doesn't happen. So yes, gender does play a role, but more importantly, what I want parents to understand is the experiences that a child has are significantly more important than, number one, what you're saying, and number two, what gender they are. Right? So there's a term called brain plasticity. It's also known as neuroplasticity. And basically what this refers to is the brain's ability to change or adapt according to life experiences. Now, if you heard that phrase just there, or that term, you realize it has absolutely nothing to do with gender. It has everything to do with the environment that the child is growing up in, and who is with them, and what type of nurturing, supporting, loving, what values, what lessons in life they're learning. It doesn't have as much to do with gender. But people make the assumption that because the brain is this biological entity that we're somehow hardwired for these roles, but the reality is the brain, because it is plastic, is that it changes with your experiences. And so your job as a parent is to guide you can't change some of the experiences that they're going to have, but your job is to help kind of guide it, is to help it make sense, is to help it develop and fit, kind of weave it into the tapestry of their life, rather than allow it to take its own course and give it no guidance. That's when we start to see kids, like where we start talking about ACEs, right? Adverse childhood experiences. This is basically a fancy way of saying trauma or really difficult life situations. When those experiences come up, you want to have a good relationship with your kids so that you can help nurture them through that. That's being a good parent. That's where parenting really starts to take a different level beyond just some of the, how old should my kid be when he starts to eat solid food, or some of that other stuff, so that makes
What
sense.
about with like age? Like, does this really change? Like, obviously, if like a baby, like, they're understanding way less than like a 5 or a 6-year-old, but like, does any of that change like the communication style? Like, where does that kind of?
Yeah, I mean, you're gonna.
You see what I'm saying?
As children develop, there's assessments that a lot of schools are starting to use. It's good and it's bad, because I think it gives at least a standard for people to look at, but I also think like that standard has to be taken into consideration, right? Especially when we're talking about developmental milestones or some of the other stuff. A 2-year-old is going to communicate differently than a 4 or 5-year-old, like vastly different. In fact, the first year of their life, or not the first year, but that for between year 1 and year 2, you'll see dramatic increases in how in their level of vocabulary. Like right around, they'll tell you, I think like around 12 months, your kid might be saying anywhere between like 5 to 10 words. But then at like 18 months, 2 years, they want them saying like close to 60 words. So think about that. You're saying 5 words, 6, 7 words, all the way up to 60. So your ability to communicate for a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old is dramatically different than, say, that 2-year-old who's communicating with 60, where at 4, they're making connections about the world, right? They're identifying emotions and thinking critically and doing all different kinds of stuff. So yeah, as the kids progress, communication patterns are going to be different, and how you relate messages are, right? How you communicate, like boundaries, is different for a kid, a small child, versus, like my son who's 5, right? Versus his older brother who's 18. So you're going to communicate with them differently on their age, and what you really want to try and focus on is having age-appropriate conversations. You're the parent, you should have a pretty good understanding of what your kid knows or doesn't know, or is capable of understanding. And a lot of times it just involves you having conversations with them and making sure that they understand it on their level, right? If you're talking about like telling a baby how life is created, you're going to have a very different conversation with like that 3-year-old if they're asking how they were born versus an 8-year-old. An 8-year-old can understand so much more, so you kind of start with simple things like, mommy loved daddy and we had you. Like, kids like, okay, cool, that makes sense. Like, I get it. You know, and they get a little bit older and it was like, well, daddy put you in my belly and mommy, you know, had you. We went to the doctor and the doctor took you out of mommy's belly. And the kid's like, okay, that makes sense. And as they start to get older, the conversation becomes more sophisticated and you can start to incorporate more. But you can't sit, you know, a 3-year-old down and be like, well, you know, daddy inserted his penis and, you know, and like start doing all that kind of stuff because they're like, what? They don't understand what that stuff is.
Yeah.
So having age-appropriate conversations is relevant. And what you'll find is you'll have the same conversations over and over and over again, just with different levels of complexity and different dynamics. Because what they understand, they have new experiences in life and they grow and they evolve. And so there's new information. And so that new information needs to find a place. And so we as parents just kind of start to filter in those bubbles. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but also like I guess what I wanted to get across was like, it's just as important as they're younger to like still be like as communicable versus like when they're just older, when like, oh, they understand now, but it's like you're literally like, I don't know, you know what?
It's okay.
Just we're gonna go past it. I had a question and I like can't formulate it, so we're good.
The part where you're talking about is, and we're gonna get to that because I actually think some of the misconception is that it's important to be present in the kid's life when they're young.
I guess, yeah.
But as they get older, you take this like kind of, you step back from parenting as much, and you do from some of the day-to-day stuff, right? Like for example,
This is what I was getting.
Right. My son is 5, and like when I wrestle with him, the only way for him to learn what good physical boundaries are or what him not to touch is for me to say that. Am I saying that to a 17-year-old? No, they know that at that point. So the conversation's just different. You're just teaching different skills. They know a little bit more about the world, they're learning, but the ability to communicate and connect with your kids throughout their development is incredibly important. One of the things that I wanted to tell people is, first, there's a process that children go through, and that process is called proliferation and pruning. And basically what that means is you start to make a bunch of different brain connections. And this is what's helpful for parents to understand, that if your kid is making brain connections, the ones that they use get strengthened. The ones that they don't use die off. So it just depends on what connections the kid is using and what you as a parent are enforcing to that child. So if a parent is focusing on empathy or aggression, are they looking at spatial ability or verbal ability? Whatever the child is focusing on is what they're going to be good at, right? So what's your kid spending time on? Ask yourself that, parents. What are they spending time on? That's generally the connections that they're starting to make, and that's what they're going to be good at. And this is kind of, I think what you were getting to is where we are with this, which is expressing emotions, which is such an important part. Obviously, as a therapist, I spend a great deal amount of time helping adults connect with their emotions and understanding which emotions are really at play. And so I actually want to take this section and I want to focus a little bit more on boys, because this is the part where I feel like the gender roles kind of split, is when we're raising little girls or we're raising women in society. There's a natural tendency for men to engage with girls differently. We talk more about feelings. There's more engaging in terms of dialogue and thoughts and thinking, and boys are more action and more play, and they get less of that, right? And so teaching your children to express themselves emotionally is a critical aspect of healthy development. More now in today's society than ever before, especially for little boys. So why am I highlighting this? Well, okay, so one suggestion that I would have for parents is to continue to develop skills in working with your young boys, especially in expressing emotions. And I'm not just talking about fucking art therapy, okay? That's great. I'm not knocking art therapy, but everybody thinks like, oh, he needs to express himself, let him paint. A lot of boys don't want to paint. Like that's an expression. It's not necessarily emotional expression for them. And we need to, as parents, I want you to start using emotional words with them to start identifying, what are you feeling in that moment, in that space? Like, the kid's pissed off. We know that. He doesn't yet. Express it. You're angry. Tell me why you're angry. What's going on? He has a right to be angry about some stuff, but here's kind of some of the point that you were starting to make. One of the things that we realize is, number one, we've talked a lot about in the podcast, like what you think determines what you feel, and what you feel and think determines your behavior, right? So as a parent, if you're struggling emotionally within yourself, and you're like, I don't know how to identify my kids' emotions, start by asking, what do they think about something? Like something happened at school. Tell me what you think about that. Like, what's going on? Like, what is everybody else saying? Right? Because what the peers are saying ultimately comes what the kid usually begins to say, because that kind of socialization process through their peers is a big deal. And if you can identify what a kid is thinking, then you generally will know what they're feeling. And it'll also tip you off to how they might be behaving. Right? And so here's something to understand. You want to start to acknowledge that, you want to start to validate that, and you want to start to support that. Because one of the scariest statistics that I'm going to share with you guys is studies have shown that right at the age of 15 to 19, when boys begin to regress emotionally and stop sharing, we see a dramatic increase in rates of suicidal behaviors for boys. Boys from the ages of 15 to 19 are 5 times more likely to commit suicide, and that is in direct recognition of the fact that they're no longer expressing themselves emotionally, because we as parents are assuming like they're okay, right? And here's what's even worse. It doesn't get better the next 4 years. From ages 20 to 24, boys are 7 times more likely to commit suicide than girls. Why? Think about every boy who's raised. How much of their time is spent on emotional expression or learning how to validate these things? Boys are spending time in the gym, they're spending time playing sports, they're spending time with their friends or playing video games. We aren't teaching them how to express themselves. And so, to answer your question, it is incredibly important for boys and girls to continue that expression of emotions and connecting with them, because what they're dealing with in the 5th and 6th grade is going to be not the same as what they're dealing with when they're in high school, and we've all been through high school, so we know that. But you still need to be able to help them connect to the emotions of what it feels like to be dumped or rejected, or as a social outcast from the group, or what it means when you don't make the cheerleading team or the football team or whatever it is. We need to kind of help them process through those things, and I think this is where, as parents, we kind of fall back and we aren't doing as good of a job as we need to be.
I think that was a really good distinction too, with the emotions versus how you said art therapy. It's not just about that. It's about being able to name things and work through them, how an adult would. But obviously it's going to be very different. But you are teaching somebody, you have the ability to teach somebody, teach your child as they're growing up how to do that. Yes. And if you don't, it's not just going to happen most likely. I mean, obviously there's probably some kids who are just very in tune, with that. But I would say that more times than not, it's probably coming just from the parents or the lack of the parents doing it. And I think that's just really important, because people are saying, boys should be more emotional. And it's I don't know if emotional is the right word, or if it's being able to name an emotion and work through it, right?
Yes.
Not necessarily be more emotional just for the sake of being emotional, because that has its own consequences. So I think being able to name that and work through something, and start by teaching them that.
Yeah, to recognize the emotion that you're feeling and then realize that there's a process to move through this. That's healthy.
Otherwise,
That's
I just
healthy.
withdraw.
Yes.
That would be just the 15 to 19 statistics. All right, I'm just going to withdraw, and I'm doing all these other things, but everything else is super internalized.
Sure, and then that age group in general, puberty is hitting, you're all kinds of funky things are happening. There's a lot going on, and there's the social pressures begin to change in that period too. Sex starts to, drugs, alcohol, all the different things start to play a role in this kid's life, and so their peer group become more important to them than parents do. And so you have to work as a parent to put yourself in that kid's life. You can't expect to sit back. My 5-year-old will come up and tell me everything in the world that is happening, right? And he'll just talk and talk and talk. I don't have to put that effort in right now. He brings it to me. But I'm fully aware of the fact that when he becomes a teenager, because I've been with other kids who are 10, 12 and raised them, my stepkids and all that kind of stuff, that when they're in that age, they're going to pull away. And it's up to you to chase them down. It's up to you to go into their room. It's up to you to hound them and to be hey, tell me what's happening at school. Where are you at? What are you doing with your friends? You have to make the effort at that point, because if you don't, they keep everything inside and they don't know how to express it. And so communication patterns and habits develop, and how those habits are reinforced as a parent is your job, is how you continue to connect with them and how you know what they're going through and why they're depressed and what depression actually looks like, because depression in boys is different than depression in girls. So it's just kind of having that understanding. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's sad. But
it is.
I mean, it makes sense though with all the other stuff, and you can just use sports, friends, the gym, whatever. It's just you're using these other things to cope with whatever's going on. not naming that. And then for girls, it's just way more acceptable to
talk
about those things and just maybe too much, but just
right. Well, the idea
maybe
is
to a detriment, but
for boys, it's like, oh, man up, or you're feeling pissed, go to the gym. Great. Well, gym helps.
I feel attacked.
Gym helps immediately with the idea of I'm feeling this intense emotion.
Yeah.
But here's the deal: you go to the gym, or you go to the courts, or you do whatever. You might feel better in the moment, but what was causing the anxiety? What was causing the anger? That's still there. So if you're not teaching them to cope with that, like the gym doesn't change that. It doesn't change what's happening around you. It makes you feel better in the moment, which is great, which is fine. We all need immediate coping mechanisms. We also need to do like problem solving and learning how to cope with things and deal with life situations. And so this is where I feel like this is where parenting creates this, there's a little bit of a dilemma, and it's a difficult paradox to kind of navigate through because children are a constant demand, right? Which is why you need to know this if you're considering having kids, because it's a tremendous constant demand in your life. Like you can't escape it. Once they're born, that's it. Like whatever was your life is gone. And there is a new life that is coming, and not just this new person, but your life is different. And there is a tremendous amount of dependency on you. And so because the kid initially is so dependent on you, that can't do anything, that dependency is created. And so we as parents get into this dilemma where we need to protect our kids, but then we forget that we have to stop protecting them. And this is where I see our society, in today's society, very different from earlier generations, and why we are having so much emotional turmoil in children these days is because of this factor. Children, we see our children as vulnerable, and we love that, and we want to protect that. But in protecting it, we're hobbling them. Mm-hmm. Because the reality is you need to stop protecting your children, and you need to expose them to the world. And in that failure to expose them to the world and the circumstances that surround them, we as a society are like so fragile and hypersensitive that because we're striving for everything to be like equal and inclusive, which is really great. It's a great idealism, but it's just not the reality of the world that we live in.
Yeah, and that is what is directly caught. Like, I know when everybody gets older, they're always like, oh, the new generation. Like, everybody says that, right? But I feel like there is something very different about like what's happening now versus like other times.
Yeah.
And that book, I mean, I talk about it all the time, but that book, Coddling the American Mind, like really opened my eyes to this, because it wasn't just like, it was like, okay, what are they seeing like coming out of the colleges? Like, what are they seeing in some of like the literature with like the kids growing up? And all of this is like fully cited. This is not just like a opinion book. Like this is literally filled with literature. These are professors who were writing this. And it was so eye-opening, like, oh, that makes so much sense. And when you are so like, how I've thought about it is like, people are going to learn one way or the other. Mm-hmm. Like, it's going to happen. And it might happen later in life for somebody, or it might happen earlier. And, unfortunately, if they're not prepared for that, it's going to like really take somebody out. Mm-hmm. And like, that is when really like bad stuff happens, when like somebody is completely unprepared for that. They have a certain view of the world, and like something shatters that, and then like depending obviously on that person, they're going to be like completely shaken up and like literally a different person after that. Mm-hmm. Sometimes for the worse. So I think that no matter what, like the idea of protecting somebody is great, but you also have to have that resilience built up. Otherwise they are literally going to crumble with anything that happens.
Right.
And it's really like, it's like this good intention, but it just doesn't work, because it's never going to work. And like when people say, oh, well, we can just change you're not going to change everybody. You know what I mean? Like there's always going to be bad people in the world, no matter how great everything is. There's going to be bad people, there's going to be bad circumstances, there's going to just be things that happen by just chance too that are just bad. And it's like, you can't let people not be prepared for that, or let kids be prepared for that, because it doesn't matter if they're 10, 15, or 30, something's bound to happen to them.
Yes. So like that societal idealism is a great idea and a really great concept, and I'm all for it. But it's damaging to our children, because unless you can create that totally utopic society, you're not preparing them for what's going to happen. So our children are growing up with a fundamental lack of coping ability. They're losing the ability to deal with those things. And so because as parents we're protecting them from the world that exists, right? And we're trying to create this alternate world. I kind of feel like it's
like a hippie commune, but like you can't do that. Like, not everybody's going to live in this world.
Do you remember
like,
the movie The Matrix? I'm just asking.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So there's that scene where like Morpheus is talking to Neo, and he's like, Neo, you've been living in a dream world. And then he's like, this is the world as it exists today. And I feel like this is what we're doing with our kids. We're creating this environment where it's like everything's great. Everything is great and everything is wonderful.
You're
and
like hooked up to this pod of goo.
Right. But then all of a sudden, like, there's an experience that the kid has that you're not there for. And then it doesn't match the world that's been created for them. And so what did you do to prepare the kid for that? Because you can't be there. You won't be there. And that's the idea, is preparing them for the times and the situations that you're not. So while I agree with equality, while I agree with striving as a society to be better and to do things in a more informed way, I also think no matter what you do, as you were just, the point you were making is the world is full of terrible things and terrible things are going to happen. And how are you preparing that kid to cope with that world?
And I would argue, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if a kid does not have that ability to control their emotions and like be able to name them, change them, work through them, that is where we're seeing all these issues. Because like the bad stuff is going to happen. So like the problem that we're seeing is that it's still going to happen, but because they don't have any of that preparation, that's when they're kind of just falling apart. Versus if, you know, something bad is going to happen, or somebody says something like mean or hurtful or whatever, and then, but they have that ability to communicate with other people, and they have that ability to recognize that it was not about, basically it all starts with that individual person. And whether it's like kids or teenagers or adults, like we all can only control that, like our own selves. And we can't rely on other people to like create this utopia for us. Like we have to create the best situation. So as an adult, obviously you're in charge of doing that, but as a parent, you kind of are in charge of teaching your kids those tools.
Yes.
Otherwise the world is going to teach that for them, and they're probably going to teach them the wrong way.
Yes, 100%. So when we protect our children so much, we're teaching them that they don't have to deal with the adversity and protect themselves. We're doing it for them. And so the reality is, I'm not talking about putting every kid in like martial arts and teaching them how to fight, but I am telling you how to prepare your kids for psychological and emotional protection and how to protect themselves in that situation. Because, and I'm going to use some offensive language here, we talked about providing this morning, but the world is full of mean things. So what are you as a parent going to do the first time somebody calls your kid a pussy or a faggot, right? What are you going to do when somebody calls your daughter a slut or a bitch or a dyke, right? The natural instinct as a parent is to listen to that and to want to defend your kid, right? That's a natural instinct, and that's great. When your kid is under attack, you want to protect them. They're small and they're innocent and they're vulnerable, and so our natural instinct is to step in and intervene. But one of the things I would ask you is, before you do that, how are you helping them to fight the battle for themselves? How are you helping them manage the situation and process through it? How are you helping them to explain it and to listen to them and to help them find their path through that, rather than just jumping in and dealing with it? I get it. I know some of those words that I just used can be hard to hear, and it's certainly not acceptable language. But as a parent, get rid of the delusion that that's not the world your kid's living in. Go into any gym locker room, talk to any coach, anybody who's ever done any level of like real athletics. Those are common words and phrases and sayings that happen on a daily basis. In locker rooms, with their friends, with gym coaches, with teachers, like forget it.
If your kids have access to the internet, which they probably do,
Yes.
like be prepared for them to stumble upon things. Like, I don't care how many protective things you have on there, especially as kids get older. You know, maybe not if you're like 6, but, you know, especially for teenagers, like, they have access to all of this.
Yes.
They're going to hear it. There are people who say it, doesn't mean that they should, but it's life. So I think as adults, the conversation that like we always try to enforce is like, okay, it's personal responsibility, like you take control of like your actions and your thoughts and whatever, but really like this should be relayed back to like this parenting message of like this, like you have to instill this in your kids, and this can start at, you know, obviously age appropriate conversations, but this starts when they're younger, because you can't just, now have a lot of us arrived to this place of personal responsibility and growth like on our own, like yes, you know what I mean, but could it have been better if we had that training earlier on and we didn't have to go through all that? Like, yes, so if you are in the position to where you have kids or you want to have kids, I think this should be like the most important thing that people are focusing on.
Yes. The ability to teach your kids how to cope with situations and stressors in life is fundamental for healthy development. Otherwise, they're going to develop in ways, and they're going to deal with it in really unhealthy ways. Mm-hmm. And those are the ways that have really negative consequences, right?
Plenty of ways.
I think one of the things that I want, this is a really important point that I wanted to make within this podcast, is teaching our children to become independent and manage the world around them. That is, you as a parent is giving them the best protection that they can have. And that's the best protection for their vulnerability. And so it's also what creates real strength. And so here's kind of a really important point to understand, is that we want our children to be stronger than the terrible things that are happening to them. If the terrible thing kills them or creates such destruction in their life, they weren't prepared to deal with it. So the idea is to prepare your kids enough to deal with the horrible things that are happening, where no matter how bad that horrible thing is, they're still stronger than that horrible thing, and they will survive. And so how do you do this as a parent? You teach them to confront their suffering voluntarily, rather than hiding from it, rather than letting circumstances dictate it to them. You teach them by confronting the pain, right? This is how they become stronger. The world is a tough, mean place, and terrible, terrible things are going to happen. And when we spend more of our time screaming about it and wasting our energy talking about how it's unfair, rather than helping the kid cope with it, then we're not preparing them. How are you preparing your kid to deal with death, or with loss, or with rejection, or with anger, or sadness, or setbacks, or inequality? You can argue all you want that you want the world to be a better place. Great. You want to know how you make the world a better place? Help your kid cope with it, so that the kid understands what equality is and how to manage his way through it, so that it doesn't crush him, or it doesn't stifle her to such a degree that she gives up on her hopes and her dreams and she goes in another direction. This is how the world becomes a better place, and it starts through parenting. And we don't get to just wash our hands with it and be like, well, he's an adult now, or he's 12 and he's making his own decisions. Like, you're still the parent. Get in there and teach them how to deal with those things. And that's really why I see increases in medication. I see increases in kids wanting to smoke marijuana legally because they have anxiety. Well, one of the first questions I ask, and I started asking the parents, is, how did you teach them to deal with anxiety? What are you having anxiety about? Great. What skills did you have? What did you try before you came here and were asking for medication? What did you do? Nothing. They did nothing, and their parents did nothing. And so if that's you, parents, start to get off your ass and take more of an interest in your life. I know that that's a little bit of a judgment coming from me as a therapist, but this is a podcast, and I'm not sitting one-on-one with you in a session. And I would say to them in a much more diplomatic way, I'd be like, look, before you start referring a kid for psychiatric medications, why don't you try these coping skills? Why don't you try working with the kid to deal with these things in a way that makes sense, and so teach them how to manage the situation. Like, suddenly the idea has become, the kid is experiencing an emotion. Well, rather than teaching them how to manage the emotion, we just want to kill the emotion with medication and CBD and everything else, and marijuana and drinking, and that's the coping mechanisms that the kids are going to learn. I'm sad, I'm going to smoke. I'm happy, I'm going to smoke. Like, where's the... It just doesn't end. And so the quick response now is to medicate kids.
Yeah, have you seen like an increase in that?
Yes.
Yeah.
100%.
And it's so interesting, because I feel like a lot of the reasons that kids get diagnosed with, I think this was on your notes, like with ADHD and like all those types of things, like those are just normal, like also like kid things, right? Yeah. So like part of that, like that'll be part of our next podcast, like that, like part of those things, it's not just like it doesn't need to be medicated necessarily, and like I think the other important thing too, and like you said that with like the medication is just kind of like numbing everything, like being able to feel things is also okay. And I know, like as an adult, like I'm super guilty of that too, like, oh, this is happening, I'll just like push it away, pretend, like drown it out with whatever, you know what I mean, like gym, drinking, this, that, like it's just super easy to like use that. But even as a kid that can happen. So if you're starting somebody really, really young with that, like, hey, you are having anxiety or you are depressed, and like obviously there's levels to this, like we're not saying like not everybody should be medicated, because there's clearly a place for medication, but it's also okay to have those emotions and to be able to work through them. Just completely dulling them is not the answer either.
Yeah. We are going to get into this in the second one, which is a really great segue right into it. So what are parents for? Teach them about those qualities. Be present in their lives, make time for them, take an interest in what they're doing, laugh with them, assume your role in their life is not just a role, but it's to develop a relationship with them. And the more you do with that, the better and more well-adjusted they'll be and the healthier they'll be. But that's pretty much what parenting kind of 101 is. Again, the how you do it is kind of up to each individual parent, but understanding that that's the main concept that we're going for. And one thing I just want you guys to take away from this is to not be so quick to medicate your kids and to start working with them on how to deal with their emotions, because they're going to experience them. And so that's one of the fundamental flaws in parenting today, is that we aren't teaching kids how to deal with those emotions. And as a result, this is why we have school shootings. This is why we have increases in depression. This is why suicide rates are higher than ever before, and not just in kids, in adults. So it's because those kids are growing up to be adults, and those adults are having children. And then if you as a parent don't express yourself well, how are you going to get your kid to do it? Like, so this isn't just like, I'm a parent and I have to push all my shit on my kid. Like, no, guess what? You have to do your own work too. And that's another conversation for another day, I guess.
Yeah, but we hope this was helpful. And like I said, we have so many clients who are parents or soon to be parents and people who listen. So I wanted to give some groundwork because there's a lot of confusion in this area, especially with, I always call it like the pop psychology, but I feel like there's so much stuff out there of like, and like you said it perfectly about the like, just being more emotional and right, like, and how to express it. Like, it's like, yes, but like, what are we getting out of this, right? And it really is about like later on in life, like certainly you can develop these skills and this resilience, but like if you have kids and you are a parent, you have the ability to teach that now, and that should be the most important job.
Yes.
And all the other things kind of fall into place, like
Yes.
what they're into, what they like, like all of that will kind of shuffle out over time. But that is so important. So thank you guys as always for tuning in. I will put Rick's contact information in the show notes if you are interested in reaching out to him. You can visit teamlocofit.com for anything else, and we will talk to you guys on Wednesday.